Hi, everybody. I'd like to take a moment to talk to you about some of the most common pre-press and file setup mistakes I see students make all the time, especially when preparing projects for print. Say that 3 times fast. All right, so here's my top 10 pet peeves for pre-press printing project mistakes. There we go. So what you've got here, starting out with number 10, color mode. I think one of the biggest mistakes that people make is selecting the wrong color mode. So what am I talking about here? Well, most of us, when we're working on the computer, we're used to working in the RGB color mode. We're using Photoshop, we're working with images, working on designs, maybe even working on something for the web or animation or video. So we've got RGB on the brain and all of our stuff is set up that way. But when we're sending something to print, it's a different world. We need to make sure that our documents and our images are converted into CMYK so that we get proper printing. Also, if you're doing any kind of specialty printing, you need to make sure that you've used the right spot colors, that those colors have been identified and laid out inside your documents. So there are a couple different ways to set that up and to make sure it works. But a good rule of thumb to get you started is to make sure that you're using the right color spaces inside your Adobe software. So select the right Adobe RGB color space, the correct CMYK color space, your gray settings and your spot, and so on. Essentially, a lot of people just leave these settings at the default, which is fine. But for me, I like to use Adobe RGB 1998 or Adobe Pro, which is another RGB color setting, which gives you the highest quality. And then I typically use a CMYK generic setting for my files. And that way, all my files are consistent and they match the right color mode when outputting or converting or printing. All right, next pet peeve I have, problem I see is using the wrong file format. So we have a couple file formats to pick from, and we need to make sure that we use the right one to do the job. In general, when printing, it's easiest to use a PDF file. That PDF file is going to contain both your raster artwork, your vector artwork, your fonts, all that stuff to make sure that they hold their quality and are presented in the optimum format. If you can't use a PDF or there's a special situation why you shouldn't, make sure you use the appropriate graphic file. So here you have some of the image file formats and then some of the vector file formats. Now, for image file formats, the real question is quality and then also transparency. For quality, you're going to use a TIFF file because it's going to be the largest file and it's going to contain all the data for printing. But you could also get away with a JPEG file if it's saved at the highest setting so that you have the highest quality in there. But for print, you're never going to use a GIF. You're never going to want to use that. You might use a PNG file if it has a transparent background. But both with a PNG and a JPEG, you can't natively save it in CMYK, which is the proper color space. So it always ends up coming back to TIFF when it comes to printable files. And then down on the bottom row, you've got your vector file formats. A lot of times you can just get away with saving it as a PDF. But if you need to, there's EPS and a couple other formats that we all use. All right, next problem that I see is missing links. So if you're using InDesign, Illustrator, or even Photoshop and you're linking files, you're placing files, you're adding those to your project, you need to make sure that those images are connected or saved or stored in a familiar folder so that when you reopen that project, you don't get that warning where stuff is missing. Another way to get around it is to embed your images inside the document. And that can work on a small scale, you know, like an Illustrator file or something like that. You can embed the images in there. But when you're using big, complex documents with multi-pages, you don't want to do that. That's going to make that thing oversized and bloated. So it's better to just have a singular folder for each project, have that InDesign file in there, and then your Illustrator, Photoshop, and image graphics in that same folder so they don't get lost and you never get this missing link warning. Next one for print is using the wrong image resolution. Now, I'm not going to lie, a lot of us go to the internet to find our images, but it's rare that you can find in a Google image search a high quality image for print, right? So if you do that, and that's your habit, you're going to wind up with a lot of really poor quality graphics when you print. Instead, you need to make sure that you're sourcing high quality images at 300 dpi, or that you're using vector graphics that are independent of resolution when you're putting together your printable projects. So pay attention to that. Make sure you get your images or make your images in the right format and the right size. Here's just an example of how that low quality image is going to look with that 72 dpi in print. You really got to stick with 300 for images, maybe even 600 for line art, to make sure that you get the best printable project. Registration black. Now, this is something that is subtle, but it makes a big difference, and a lot of people don't know about it. So what happens really is when you're designing something on the computer, you're designing it on a digital display. And when a digital display reads black, it's the absence of light, the absence of color. And so your screen looks dark black. But that's not the case when you're using black ink on white paper. Black ink on white paper actually looks like dark gray. It doesn't really look like a rich, deep, dark black. So it's very important that when you're designing something intended for print, that you use the correct color swatch, the correct black color swatch in your artwork. And usually that means a combination, especially in CMYK, of additional ink colors added to your black. So here's some different scales that people use. If you want to just have a good solid black, what I tend to do is actually like 25% cyan, 25% magenta, 25% yellow, and then 100% black. And that makes a nice, even dark black. You can go more than that, like here on the rich black, it says 63, 52, 51. That'll make a really dense black, but it might oversaturate the paper with ink. So you got to worry about that a little bit. Or you can tint it, a little cooler black, redder black. That's what you're doing. Here's just another slide to kind of show that example where your page will show up printed, especially with inkjet ink. You're going to see a gray tone instead of a dark black tone. So you need to pay attention to that when you're selecting black in your documents. Printer marks. When you're going to print, you're going to need printer marks. A lot of times we get away with, just handing off a file and letting the printer take care of this. But in today's world, when you're uploading and sending out your own printable files to different service vendors, you need to know how these printer marks work. So sometimes it's just simply adding crop marks or trim marks. Sometimes it's adding a bleed area to your document. Sometimes it's adding color bars. All of these things can be adjusted and set in the saving process of your PDF file. So when you create a PDF file from Adobe InDesign or Adobe Illustrator, there is a marks and bleed section where you can add your trim marks, your registration marks, etc. And you can extend the bleed area of your document so that it extends to the right distance for printing. And that's going to assist you more than anything, is making sure that you use those trim marks in the right bleed settings on your documents. Measurements. This one's kind of funny. It surprises me. Personally, I'm a little OCD about measurements. And so when I'm designing something, I usually kind of plan out the size before I even get started. But some people don't do that, and they just kind of work randomly and they just let the file kind of come together. It's really important to know the size of your printable document before you make your project, right? Also, it's important to understand the orientation. Is it going to be landscape, portrait? Is it going to fit in a frame? Is it not meant to go in a frame? What's it going to be? So set up your document with the correct measurements in the beginning. Then size your artwork to match that document. A lot of times what people will do is they'll grab an image, open that in Photoshop, and then try to shove that into the size later on. And then they have a tough time cropping it or resizing it. It doesn't work. It's much better to start with the blank page, set it up at the right dimension for your printing project, then bring your artwork into that page and size it scale it, and even crop it to fit. So pay attention to those dimensions. In typical form, we're talking letter, tabloid, postcard size, business card size, whatever. Make sure you're using those right dimensions to get the right project. And not every dimension is the same, and you can't just stretch things. No stretching. Do not stretch. Okay, next problem that I see a lot is missing fonts. So with the way things work, you can download fonts from anywhere. A lot of times people are sharing them and finding them online. That's great. It's cool. We got a lot of typography out there, but you always have a problem when you get to your document again and that font is not installed on that computer, or maybe you've made that project and sent it to somebody else, and the next message you get back from them is, where's the font file? Because you got to save those font files and they got to travel with your document. Of course, if you're using a PDF to transport your design, hey, you can get away without embedding the fonts because the PDF file contains them. But if you're going to share an Illustrator file or an InDesign file, even a Photoshop file with someone, and you have a specialty font embedded in there, you're going to need to make sure you save and send that font with it. Otherwise, you get this, where you get that file open and you get all these pink lines and your pretty little fonts, and all your work that you did laying out your document is all messed up because your fonts are gone. So here's another situation where you need to be a little OCD. Pay attention to where you save your font files. Pay attention to where you put them. Next problem I see a lot is spelling errors, right? You should just run spell check. It's so easy. Spell check, you just click it, push it, it checks your document. Of course, it's not going to find every grammar error, but it's going to get the most obvious ones. So make sure you run that spell check to make sure you don't have any errors in spelling. There's nothing worse than going to print on something, getting it back, and there's a big bad spelling error. Next thing I would suggest is having a proofreader. Have somebody check your work before you send it to press. They're going to find your mistakes. People are good at that. Let someone else look at it, make sure that it's right. All right, so here we are, ready for number one. The number one problem I see, which I just can't stand: incorrect margins and bleeds. So in image terms, we don't really care about this very much. We don't care about a bleed area, especially when you're working with a digital image, a digital photograph. In fact, you want things to be exactly the right size. But in printing, it doesn't work that way. We need extra space. We need stuff off the edge because we're going to cut things out. And when we cut things out, we do not want a little white mini border around the edge. We want our artwork or our photograph or something to extend past the edge, so that in the manufacturing process, we get it cut down to the right size. So if you don't want to bleed and you purposely want a white border, knock yourself out. Make sure that you set your margin to the right size so that you don't have that any problem there. But a lot of people want their photograph, their art, or their graphic to go beyond the edge of the border. So what does that mean? That means when you're working in Photoshop, you need to build that in. You need to build in that extra 1/4 inch. If you're working in Illustrator, extend the page. Let your artwork go beyond the page, because that's what you're going to need when you want that thing to print right. So pay attention to that bleed setting, set it up properly in your preliminary files, and then repeat that when you get to InDesign and you do your layout. So you make sure that you always have that bleed area, that extra space around the edge of the border, to make sure that you can cut it off and trim it to the right size. Here's a little diagram that kind of shows that. You have these trim marks, which cut to the document size, but then that blue line represents that extra space, that extra edge that you always want around the edge to give yourself space. All right, so those are my most common mistakes that I'd want you to avoid. Pay attention to those errors that you run into when you're working on your projects. If you do that, if you follow those 10 things, you're going to save yourself a lot of headaches when it comes to printing. All right, so I hope that helps. Pay attention to what you're doing and have a good time. See you later.